Before I introduce our dean, I would like to give you a quote from Nelson Mandela to kind of shape our conversation today. To deny people their human rights is to challenge their very humanity. And that was from Nelson Mandela. So today's program, we're going to have Dean Pulley say a few words, and we're going to turn it over to James Boswell for a wonderful panel discussion and offer some Q&A, and then close out today's session. So thank you all for joining us. We're delighted to have you here as a part of this very important conversation. I'd like to introduce our dean that you probably all already know, but Dean Larry Pulley, to make a few remarks.
Thank you, Carlene, and let me add my voice to hers in welcoming you. I can also say with great confidence that you are in for an important and valuable discussion this afternoon. I have been privileged to attend the 3 other Perspective Series conversations, and I have not only learned, but I have been changed by being able to participate and hear from and engage with. I also have to apologize. I am going to have to leave right after introducing James. The provost has called an important meeting of deans and others starting at noon today to talk about the future of online learning at William & Mary, and we cannot not be a part of that conversation given our focus on that in the Mason School. But I have already been assured that this is being recorded, so I will be able to hear later on and participate later on. I am delighted now to turn the podium over by way of brief introduction to our moderator today, James Boswell. James is an adjunct professor of business law here, also longtime executive partner in the Mason School. He graduated from William & Mary in 1986 before going on to law school and graduate school. I'm delighted to say he is a founding member of our remarkable Mason School Diversity and Inclusion Committee, and I want to commend them. They are the driving force behind our Perspective Series conversations, and they have done thus far a spectacular job. So thank you very much. And James also currently serves in that group as the chair of the climate subcommittee. So without further ado, welcome, James, and thank you.
Thanks, Dean Pulley, for that very kind introduction. I want to also extend a warm welcome to all our participants within the Mason community and the broader William & Mary community and beyond. As Carlene said, this is the 4th in an ongoing series presented by the Mason Schools Diversity and Inclusion Committee. And we thank all the members of the committee and our administration for supporting and encouraging these efforts to foster thoughtful discussions around the concept of inclusivity and belonging. I hope you were all able to join us last month when we heard from D&I leaders at Google and Amazon and Intel about their focused strategic efforts to welcome employees of all backgrounds, including LGBTQ employees. And indeed, Intel's chief data scientist described quantifiable data linking D&I efforts with positive measurable outcomes, such as productivity and stock price and more. Successful D&I efforts include things like focusing on intersectionality and representation and advocacy. McKinsey & Company regularly publishes studies underscoring the important role corporate America has played in the progress of LGBTQ rights. Businesses have become important allies in the struggle for workplace equality. 206 major corporations signed a Friend of the Court brief this past spring, advocating for the Supreme Court's June 2020 decision protecting LGBTQ individuals from workplace discrimination. And of course, we can't hold a program like this without mentioning that the recent election resulted in more LGBTQ candidates elected to office than ever before. However, according to McKinsey, the growing business case for inclusion has not translated into solid gains for the LGBTQ community in the workplace. Just as women continue to strive to break through that glass ceiling, LGBTQ employees continue to strive to break out of the glass closet. Even within the LGBTQ community, experiences vary dramatically. Trans workers, for example, have seen the least progress, toward that sense of inclusivity and belonging that just about all of us hope for in our careers. Today, we are so fortunate to be joined by 3 scholars who have studied the LGBTQ experience and who will offer their insights about what these recent developments mean for LGBTQ workers and their allies, and what the future looks like. I'm excited for you to meet our panelists. I'm going to introduce each one briefly, and then ask each panelist to share with us a quick overview of their research, the projects they're currently working on, whatever else they'd like for us to know. I'll move on to in-depth questions for the panelists, and then after that, there will be time for questions from you, our participants. You'll see a Q&A tab at the bottom center of your screen, which you can use to send questions through the Zoom chat, and I'll relay those questions to the panelists. If you particularly want one of the panelists in particular to respond to your question, please make a note of that when you send the question through so I know which way to direct it. Our panelists today are Dr. Jay Watkins, who teaches history here at William & Mary, Dr. Ian Lekus, who formerly taught history at Harvard and is now LGBTQ thematic specialist at Amnesty International, and Dr. Lisa Meyer, who is director of the American Studies program here at William & Mary and a professor of history. Dr. Jay Watkins, welcome. Tell us a bit about yourself and your work.
Hi there. Yeah, thanks for having me. Very glad to be here. So I am a Southern queer historian. My background is in sort of Southern history in the 20th century, in the modern U.S., and with a focus on queer history. My graduate work and then my first book is called Queering the Redneck Riviera, Sexuality and the Rise of Florida Tourism. And I'm continuing to focus on the queer South, but now looking at theater, specifically around the AIDS crisis in the South and the ways that Southerners especially used theater as activism. I also work with queer students here, and I'm co-advisor with Lisa for the LGBTIQ research project.
Super, thanks, Jay. Dr. Ian Lekus, welcome to William & Mary. I think you got I think somebody mentioned that you're a faculty member here, but you are in fact former faculty at Harvard, and tell us about your role with Amnesty International.
Sure. I'm open to the negotiations, especially given the business school climate. The questions that took me into academia a long time ago are the questions that led me into human rights work, more recently. How do we make change? How do we make structural change, tangible change, and how do we make intangible cultural change? In my academic career, I was really interested in sort of how do people move between movements? How do people, for example, in civil rights and women's liberation, go into gay liberation, and feminism, and use their ideas for new causes. And ultimately about when we expand democracy, who gets left out. All of that then goes into my human rights work with Amnesty International, which, as you may know, is the largest and oldest human rights organization in the world, with about 60 years old, about 7 million members around the world. And what we do, and what I do, is to bring attention to the crises of human rights around the world, support human rights defenders. When it comes to LGBTQ issues, that's particularly looking at the fact that authoritarian regimes all over the world, Russia, Egypt, Turkey, Tanzania, Uganda, Chechnya, plenty more, use LGBTI people as scapegoats in sort of to draw attention away from their crackdown on civil society and a free and functional society. And so we do a lot of work to bring those abuses to light. I also do a whole lot of work with our partners in other organizations in the government to make US foreign policy more LGBTI friendly, and a lot of border work addressing what's happening along the US-Mexico border and in ICE detention centers. So that is a quick overview of what I'm doing. I'll also just say that even though it's not gonna be the focus today, I do a bunch of consulting, and my work around talent development, retention, and promotion also is informing some of my thoughts about the intersection between workplace issues and my human rights agenda.
Thanks, Ian. That's a lot of important work. Dr. Lisa Meyer, welcome. Tell us about yourself and your work.
It's hard to follow something like that and seem relevant. Anyway, my work, I'm the director of American Studies right now in terms of my position. My work is in, broadly speaking, 20th century US, for the most part, cultural history, history of sexualities, LGBTIQ histories, women's history. Women's history is where I started. My first book was called Creating G.I. Jane. I have a cat on my lap now. I apologize for those watching the webinar. He doesn't get much attention. Creating G.I. Jane, which was focused on the Women's Army Corps during World War II and sexuality and power in the Women's Army Corps during World War II. I've done a lot of work as an editor. As the editor of feminist studies, I sort of organized, wrote the call for, vetted, and sort of wrote the preface for the one of the first volumes on transgender studies and critical race theory. So transgender studies and race in particular, that I'm very proud of. And what I'm most proud of right now in terms of the work I'm doing is the work that Jay referenced at the end of his introduction, which is with the LGBTIQ, the William and Mary LGBTIQ Research Project, documenting LGBTIQ history in Virginia. There's been we've done a lot of terrific work, and we're hoping, crossing fingers, all things going well, that we'll be able to debut the digital exhibit in the spring of 2021. We've gathered wonderful oral histories anyway, of this Commonwealth and its history.
That's great, Lisa. Thank you. I think all of you in our audience can see why I'm so excited about this panel. So let's begin with a question for Jay Watkins. Many people are asking, now that LGBTQ workers have legal protection against workplace discrimination, can we expect businesses to follow the law and do the right thing?
Yes and no. I mean, to equivocate a little bit. So we've seen over the course of the 20th century that real change in the lives of LGBTQ folks has come through activism, the market, and the federal government. So in the 50s, we've got homophile activists picketing the White House. We've got queer sex workers and trans youth who occupied spaces such as Compton's Cafeteria and Cooper's Donuts with their bodies in the mid-1960s. Stonewall happened and gave birth to the modern Pride movement. People were at the forefront of calling for liberation for all, really a radically different world. There was anti-racist and anti-capitalist critique. Through the 70s, we get the slogan, come out wherever you are. The idea being, of course, that visibility would show that gay people are everywhere and would lead to rights and such. By the middle of the 70s, we've got national advertisers in the gay press. I'll use Advocate as an example. It went from a bi-weekly activist newspaper to a glossy fashion and lifestyle magazine. Along the way, the magazine ditched anything sexy, any critique of capitalism. The drag queens, the sissies, and the trans folks got thrown under the bus as we chased market share. Gay men were climbing the corporate ladder, usually deeply in the closet. Then AIDS hit, and those white gays that were trying so hard to be the best little boys in the world were thrown back in the gutter. Their race and class privilege didn't really protect them. At the same time, more national brands were courting the gay dollar. We confused being advertised to with being accepted. But across the country, we were winning local non-discrimination protections and local governments. Some businesses were extending domestic partner benefits, but health insurance companies, a business model that is of course wholly immoral, were denying coverage to gay people and speeding up their deaths of AIDS patients. Landlords were evicting sick people and lovers because they weren't married. ACT UP, the AIDS coalition to unleash power, got us medication and saved lives. Those angry dykes and fags who blocked traffic and put their bodies on the line quite literally saved us, and we have them to thank for the infrastructure that will ultimately bring us a COVID vaccine. The Supreme Court decided that we didn't even deserve the right to privacy in the '86 Bowers decision, but then in the 2003 Lawrence decision, they reversed that. At the start of the 21st century, it looked like we were on our way, but our politicos sold us out in the push for marriage equality. Rather than put our energy into changing the system, we were told that winning equality with straight people was the way to go. We would do that by showing them that we were just like them, except who we loved or what we did in the bedroom. This is simply not true. We are different, no matter how much mainstream gays say otherwise. And so we fought for access to a profoundly unequal system to protect the privilege of a few. Rather than try for liberation for all, we put our energy into marriage, and those of us that wanted more were told to be quiet. Hashtag love is love. Hashtag love wins, except when it's poly or slutty or queer or gender non-conforming, or the list goes on. The military lets us serve openly, but rainbow imperialism is still imperialism. Businesses jumped on the bandwagon and expanded access to health insurance, but when marriage was decided, many shut down access to benefits to partners that were not married. Businesses wash their atrocities in rainbows and expect us to thank them. Lockheed Martin scores great with HRC, but sells the weapons that kill Black and brown queers around the world. Wells Fargo sponsors Pride, but also financed the Dakota Access Pipeline. AT&T gives most of its money to Republicans. Anthem Blue Cross Blue Shield stopped covering my HIV meds. Luckily, I could switch. Others are not so lucky and will die of AIDS-related complications. Health insurance tied to employment is immoral. So, to bring it back to the original point, yes, some businesses will do the right thing as long as it helps them. Others will not. Some businesses have been at the forefront of granting benefits and protections when the government refused to do so. Some have lagged behind. After years of repression, it can feel nice to be the popular girl, but there's a heavy price to be paid for being capitalism's sassy best friend. So relying solely on the market will always end badly because businesses will always act in the interest of profit. Relying on the government will yield some results and some protections, but given the preponderance of religious freedom laws and lawmakers unwilling to tell conservatives to sit down and shut up, government can't be our sole hope. Plus, despite the recent SCOTUS decision, we still have right to work laws. I can be fired tomorrow as long as nobody says out loud that it's because I'm gay. So at the moment, we have to rely on a mix of government and market forces, I think.
Thank you, Jay. That's a lot of information in a short period of time. A lot to think about, and I think we could spend several hours going on that. You mentioned something about pushback or backlash from groups who feel threatened by the progress that any group makes. Ian, how do we make sense of the progress that's been made compared to the backlash that we've seen in the past and potentially backlash that we may be seeing in the future?
Sure, thank you, James. And Jay, you set me up in a couple of different ways. And I suspect like Jay and like Lisa, I could go on for about 2 hours just on my ideas. But thinking about our audience, thinking about the questions here, I wanted to emphasize 2 big points. The US is not in a vacuum. The United States is, the cultural, the political trends we're talking about, the cultural trends, even the legal trends we're talking about are not happening just here, and the United States is not just at the forefront. You may realize depending on how you count what's a country, or the US is somewhere between the 17th and the 20th country to have marriage equality, not the first, second, or third. It's the 5th in this hemisphere. And I will spare the whole long lecture on the deep history of backlash and progress until at least the Q&A. But I will talk about the fact that backlash is not, it's easy to sort of get into, sort of assume there's just cycles of backlash. The 60s as a cycle responding to 50s domesticity, Trumpism, the Tea Party responding to Obama. Is there some truth in that? Bits and pieces, sure. And it's even more so when we're thinking about LGBTQ people, talking about the campaigns in the 70s to repeal the first anti-LGBT discrimination laws. Famously, Anita Bryant in Florida, or Phyllis Schlafly, who you may have seen depicted on Mrs. America on Hulu recently by Kate Blanchett. The idea that 70s conservative women's organizing was just a backlash to women's liberation. Is it in part? Absolutely. Much more is going on, though. It's likewise that the right develops a language of family values in response to and talking about the rights of wives, the rights of divorced women to alimony, taking the rights language of women's liberation and women's movement. And so we get family values politics. Well, guess what? We don't get marriage equality without family values. We don't get a movement, for 30 years, from the early 70s to the late 90s, the number one piece of agenda, number one thing on the quote unquote gay agenda was, workplace discrimination law and the employment non-discrimination law. But there's a popular movement for marriage equality. And I don't think that without a movement that ultimately reframes itself not in terms of legal rights, but in terms of protecting same-sex families, marriage equality doesn't jump ahead of workplace discrimination as the preeminent issue. So what I'm getting at is the idea that backlash is not just a, oh, I don't like you, but movements, movements learn from each other, not only the progressive movements that I studied in my academic career, but anti-LGBT movements and progressive movements learn, movements across the ideological spectrum learn from each other to move forward. And so we need to sort of get into the interplay of these movements to understand what's going on. And I'll talk more about this, especially in a global context, but I want to, probably running down on time, but Jay set me up so perfectly for one example about Coca-Cola's Love is Love campaign in Hungary. Last year, as you may know, Hungary has a far-right government that has come under a lot of condemnation for violating basic freedoms, for really violating everything that the European Union demands its members do. And it's particularly made targeted LGBTQ rights. It passed a law this spring about sex markers at birth are immutable, cannot be changed. And it just introduced yesterday new amendment around restricting LGBTQ rights. Last year, Coca-Cola decided to sponsor a musical festival in Budapest with the theme Love is Love. The music festival had the Love Festival theme. And the campaign featured same-sex couples as well as opposite-sex couples. And it became a lightning rod for the Hungarian right political leadership to really attack Western, Coca-Cola as one more example of Western imperialism and sort of imposing external norms and rights that aren't authentically Hungarian. And this is a pattern we see all over the world, from Russia, Sub-Saharan Africa, Southeast Asia, et cetera. Eventually, the Hungarian right claimed victory when Coca-Cola ended its campaign. However, it ended its campaign 2 weeks after the music festival. So it's not really clear to me or to many people that they actually caved at all. But I bring this up in terms of the point between expecting Coca-Cola advertising to be the vanguard of liberation is fraught, to say the least. But that our issues are at the flashpoint between global capitalism and reactionary movements that sort of assume an eternal national identity, like Hungary, an internal religious identity, and an internal notion of what sex and gender is. And I'm going to come back to that in Q&A.
Thanks, Ian. That international perspective is so important. We see that there has been a lot of progress in certain places for employees identifying as lesbian or gay in the workplace, but that progress, such as it is, may not have been matched by a similar trajectory for all employees, particularly those identifying as transgender or gender non-normative in the workplace. Lisa, you've studied that quite a bit. Can you share your thoughts with us?
Sure. Thank you. And thank you, Jay and Ian, for just wonderful, sassy and informative and fun and thoughtful presentations. I could talk, in thinking about what to do in terms of what to put together for these sort of 7 minutes. I could talk about the long history of the Employment Non-Discrimination Act, for example, that over the past 2 decades has been passed by the House, but tabled by the Senate, then passed by the Senate, not by the House. That was under Obama. Then most recently passed by the House again. And of course, the Senate is not going to pass. I'm not going to move on it. But what you might not know is that that Employment Non-Discrimination Act initially did not include gender identity and expression. And this was a sort of a flashpoint, if you will, with, among LGBTQ activists and people in terms of, I guess the point I'm trying to make is, starting at the beginning, is that trans inclusion and the need to address sort of discrimination as well as not just in terms of lesbians and gay men and bisexuals, but also transgender men and women, has not always been something that LGBTQ people, communities, activists have done themselves. So I just wanted to put that out there, just as a little point of history. But I also really wanted to start digging into the Bostock decision a little bit that James talked about it in his introduction to this panel. The Supreme Court decision in Bostock in June 15th, I think it was 2020, ruled that Title VII of the Civil Rights Act protects gay and transgender workers, lesbians, gay men, bisexual men and women, and transgender workers from workplace discrimination, right? And that was unexpected. I was surprised by it. There was sort of all manner of celebration. It seems to hand our movement a huge victory, LGBT equality and equity in terms of workplace, especially. And until that decision, it was legal in more than half the states that in this country to fire workers for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. And so the decision seems very consequential, right, in terms of extending workplace protection to millions of people across the nation, and continuing a series of kind of surprising Supreme Court victories for LGBTQ rights, even after President Trump transformed the court with his appointments, and as well as federal appellate courts, etc. But if we read the opinion, we also see that the court's ruling was specific to the firing of employees because of their sexual orientation or gender identity. And that might seem, you might say, well, so what? But that might seem, okay. But in the majority decision, I just want to call your attention that Neil Gorish, who crafted the majority opinion, also addressed some of the other concerns that those employers bringing the case had raised in the defendants in the case had raised in the three cases about the effect of the court's ruling on issues like bathrooms in the workplace, locker rooms, dress codes. None of those issues, Gorish said, in his opinion, were before the court in these cases. Instead, what he said, he stressed that the court is ruling only that, quote, an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender defies the law. Whether sex segregated bathrooms or locker rooms or dress codes might violate Title VII, he said, are questions for future cases. Gorish also added that the same was true for questions involving the relationship between Title VII and federal laws and constitutional provisions protecting religious freedom. So although other employers, and this is another quote from the case, although other employers in other cases may raise free exercise arguments, and he's speaking about free exercise of religion, religious liberty clause in our US Constitution, may raise free exercise arguments that merit careful consideration. None of the employers before us today represent in this court that compliance with Title VII will infringe their own religious liberties in any way. That is for future cases. Again, I don't want to diminish what a wonderful sort of victory this was, but again, I calling attention to Gorish's language that an employer who fires an individual merely for being gay or transgender defies the law, and then his putting off the other issues in terms of sort of the Religious Freedom Clause cases that have come up, or religious freedom, the ways in which some corporations, some businesses have continued to discriminate against LGBTQ people through religious freedom claims, and then putting that off, as well as the bathroom bills. I'm sure you're all familiar with the current constitution of this court, makes me very nervous. As a historian, I want to bring up another case that I think speaks to this question. This is it wasn't a Supreme Court, a US Supreme Court case. It was a Washington State Supreme Court decision in 1992, Jane Doe versus Boeing. So Jane Doe was a self-identified male to female transgender woman who was a Boeing engineer in the late 70s through the mid 80s. And in 1985, she began transitioning to affirm her true gender identity, and she changed her dress and physical appearance to reflect her gender and sex identification. And also she notified her supervisors or coworkers, et cetera, that her physical appearance would change. Boeing was not, didn't jump up and down about this. They weren't thrilled about this. They were very, excuse me, I got a phone call and I forgot to turn my phone off. They were very, very confused. And in her workplace in particular, they were concerned about what they talked about, new potentially dangerous issues. And so they tried to create some personnel policies to deal with this. And after several months of deep thought, the policy they came up with was they asked her not to dress, or they asked her to dress in a gender neutral fashion. So to wear either male or unisex clothing. And again, I want to draw attention to how gender neutral is male in terms of how they're doing this. And so Jane Doe is trying to negotiate the boundaries of Bowen's request for gender neutrality while she's simultaneously moving through her own transition to affirm her gender identity. So in doing so, she's negotiating between a kind of intense pressure to conform to masculine norms. Again, this is an engineering firm, and even to this day, engineering is a predominantly masculine field. And by that, I mean predominantly populated by men. So she's trying to negotiate between this pressure to conform and also an expression of her gender that was being pathologized and clearly identified as outside corporate norms. And so she gets disciplined when her dress is not unisex enough, and she was wearing nail polish. Okay, so you could argue that that's perhaps not unisex, but what's interesting, a couple of things are interesting about this. She had no problem changing her name legally or on her driver's license or other official documents, or receiving a new security clearance under her new name. The problems arose around her move from being a masculine appearing male engineer to a feminine appearing female engineer. So in other words, from the deeply sexist, in many ways, corporate culture that was foundational to Boeing in the 80s and the 90s, and some would argue to this day. And I also want to note that, again, she wasn't terminated because of her dress. She was terminated over the issue of entering a women's bathroom in her workplace. So thinking back to that, being a bit unsettled by Gorish's remarks in that seemingly monumental victory in Bostock. In an early precedent, has more recently been known as the bathroom bills, this Doe decision, which is, when I say that, it's a reference to legislation in states and localities across the country that has been created to clarify what bathrooms a transgender person has to use, and the hysteria over the possibility of a person who has transitioned from their male sex at birth to female in an affirmation of their female gender identity entering a women's restroom. Doe lost this case, but the challenges posed by Jane Doe versus Boeing Company eventually led in 2006 to Boeing instituting an anti-discrimination policy that covered gender identity. In fact, they were one of the first of this type of corporation, what I would argue is a masculine identified profession corporation, to do so. But again, it's not clear at all if that corporate non-discrimination policy would cover another trans employee entering a bathroom that coworkers or management viewed as inappropriate for their sex. I want to say use one last example. We also need to think more broadly about what we consider a workplace or job in relation to discrimination. When Dr. Watkins was speaking, he talked about corporations and various corporations, Wells Fargo, et cetera. When Dr. Lekus was speaking, he was talking about corporations, and he also did mention the military in a kind of gesture to imperialisms. And that's where I want to end in many ways. Is if we think about the military as a workplace, right? For decades, transgender people were prohibited from serving openly in the U.S. military. And the Pentagon lifted this ban after a 2 years long intensive working group study that came up with they concluded that readiness would not be affected by admitting or acknowledging transgender people. So the Pentagon lifts this ban in June 30th, 2016. And acknowledging in the language that it's in the military's best interest to recruit and retain the best troops, regardless of their gender identity. So following that 2016 announcement, transgender people already serving in the military were able to do so openly. They could no longer be discharged simply because of their gender identity. In addition, transgender service members were able to access all medically necessary healthcare and officially change their gender in Pentagon personnel systems. In January 2018, openly transgender recruits were able to join the military for the first time. despite attempts by the Trump-Pence administration to block them from doing so. And on that side of things, on July 26, 2017, President Trump, I don't know, some of you might have seen these, posted a series of tweets in the early morning hours announcing, quote, "The United States government will not accept or allow transgender individuals to serve in any capacity in the US military." And he went on to do there were very, very hostile quotes. Those tweets were widely condemned, including by a group of more than 56 retired generals and admirals who came out with a statement that, a signed statement that went sort of national and went viral, that Trump's reinstitution of the ban, if it was implemented, would degrade military readiness. And the lead signatory to that statement was a retired 4-star Marine Corps general. So there's a pushback in terms of Trump's tweets. But a month after the initial tweets, President Trump issued a formal memorandum detailing the ban and directing Secretary of Defense at the time, James Mattis, to produce implementation recommendations, which Mattis did in March of 2018. So in response, there are lawsuits filed, challenges to the constitutionality of the ban, and several federal courts issued injunctions preventing the sort of Trump-Pence administration from implementing the ban while these cases proceeded. But on January 22nd, 2019, the Supreme Court, okay, so 6 months prior to this victory that we just had in Bostock, the Supreme Court lifted the injunctions and allowed the Department of Defense to implement the ban while that litigation continued. So and the Supreme Court chose not to issue a ruling on the ban itself. So April 12th, 2019, the administration begins implementing the ban, and the ban continues to this day, right? In terms of the transgender people who who are in the service now can continue to serve, even though they're under a kind of stigma in many ways, in the sense that transgender people cannot enter the military now any longer. And people in the military who wish to transition cannot do so. And healthcare is an issue for some folks who are in the military right now, transgender people. I'll just conclude by saying that we have to wait and see if the effects of Bostock will be as profound across the country as the Obergefell decision that granted marriage equality, even though I agree with both Jay and Ian on that that was not the route I would have taken as an advocate for LGBTQ rights. And I'll also admit to be feeling more than slightly uneasy at the ways in which Garish, writing for the majority, noted explicitly that the issue of bathrooms or locker room usage and religious exemptions were not covered by the Bostock ruling, and also by the Supreme Court ruling in January, and actually it was a year and 6 months ago, so January 2019, that their decision not to rule on the ban of transgender people in the military itself, they let that go, and they allowed the ban to proceed. So I'll end there.
Thanks, Lisa. That's wonderful. And your comments particularly about the Boeing case, the engineer, remind me of the work that Colonial Williamsburg is doing right now. Some research on Thomasine, who lived in Virginia 400 years ago.
Yes.
And the Virginians at Jamestown were grappling with that, because some days Thomas would show up and some days Thomasine would show up. And right. the research now, it looks like at some point in that dispute, they say, well, you need to dress half male and half female. So and so anybody that thinks that this is new or recent, and of course going back well before colonization of North America, these are things that people have been struggling with and trying to find solutions. Let me ask you, and for any of you, because you all touched on this in different ways. There's a need, it seems, to have legal affirmation of whatever our worldview is, and so we want a court decision that says we're right about this. But the marketplace is also tremendously powerful, and I'm wondering things like the religious freedom, which is sort of a pushback to LGBTQ rights and advancements, and the Gorsuch comments that you pointed out, Dr. Meyer. Do we, I think about a wedding cake and a baker who doesn't want to make a cake for a same-sex wedding, right? So the business case, the business argument that is that I'm going to open a bakery across the street and I'm going to cater to everybody and try to put that guy out of business. Now that's overly simplistic, but how powerful is the marketplace? Dr. Watkins mentioned that it takes the market, it takes government, it takes so many different aspects. But and you were talking about the bathrooms. Does it have to be binary? Do we have to stick with the male female? What are the options for business no matter what the government does? What are some strategies for business to make inclusive workplaces?
Can I start just for a second there?
Please.
Because there's a great example, which is Target, right? Target has gender neutral bathrooms. And so that is one of the ways that some businesses have responded, is by, and actually has received a lot of pushback and criticism for it, as well as a lot of sort of praise, but they have received, there's been, they've taken a hit because they do that. And so that's, I would offer that as one example of how a fairly major business that many people know of and probably go into and use, made a decision about creating gender neutral bathrooms so that there would be, those possibilities would be offered. So I'll stop there because I see others of my panelists leaning forward as if they have other ideas too.
Ian, you look like you're ready.
Sure.
To share a thought there.
Yeah, I have about 5 or 6 different thoughts here. And actually the last one that came to mind as you were just talking, Lisa, was about a local establishment here in the DC area, Busboys and Poets, which has completely reconfigured the architecture of bathrooms to be gender neutral. And it's like, we aren't actually bound by the architecture we've used for however long. And I'm not a scholar of history of architecture in general, let alone the architectural history of bathrooms, although there could be a great queer history of that. But thinking about the workplace question, thinking about religious discrimination, or perhaps a Freudian slip, masterpiece, cake, and the day after Election Day here, the hearing at the Supreme Court of Fulton versus City of Philadelphia, which was not a market-based question, but is a lawsuit pending before the court about a Catholic civil service charity that is refusing to certify same-sex parents as foster parents. As with Bostock, again, I could be surprised like we were with Bostock to even its limited degree. I think we're either looking at a catastrophic setback or potentially a procedural setback like Masterpiece Cake was. But I want to bring attention to the fact that this movement for religious freedom is not happening, is a global movement. That this is part and parcel of literally decades of US religious leaders exporting homophobia throughout Eastern Europe and Russia, throughout Sub-Saharan Africa, throughout Southeast Asia, and that the language, when Secretary Pompeo convenes the Commission on Inalienable Rights, he is making an attempt to reify religious liberty over other kinds of basic fundamental human rights, including most notably the rights around gender and sexuality. And he has some very enthusiastic partners in Poland, in Hungary, in Russia, and elsewhere. So I think this gets back to sort of one of the things that fascinates me. And if this was the hour version of my talk, I would talk in depth about how the world is simultaneously coming together and falling apart at the same time. That we have homogenization around popular culture, about political culture, even before the internet. This was well underway. It's accelerated with the internet, but frankly, it's been happening since 19th century imperialism at the latest, in terms of the idea that there is one way to be this member of a religious group, or one way to be to be queer. and sort of our labels, our categories, we have all sorts of reification of categories happening, and that, to get to the point about it, Thomas and Thomasine, or what has happened in all around the world over for literally centuries. Sexual and gender diversity is not eternal. Is not recent. But rainbow flags are recent. The idea that there is one particular way to be LGB or T is actually more recent than we want to think it is. And that gives authoritarians a place to make their stand. And then that gets to the question about the workplace. It's like, if we're dealing with non-discrimination, what does Boeing's overseas offices look like? If we're looking at, and I haven't actually Googled where Boeing has offices, but let's just take Coca-Cola. Let's take Microsoft. If its offices in Indonesia may have a different set of laws and different policies, and so how do we promote work if we're going to rely on companies to promote workplace inclusion? How does that work with some radically different laws and cultures, which are nowhere near monolithic in each of themselves? There's only so far we can rely on corporations, especially when we think about who they are accountable to. They're an opportunity, and I absolutely am delighted that my partners at Human Rights Campaign at the National Gay and Lesbian Chamber of Commerce are working to make businesses, to promote LGBT entrepreneurs around the world. At the same time, I do have the same concerns that Jay echoed in his opening comments about where, what are the limits thereof.
Thank you, Ian. Jay, we have about a minute before we want to jump into Q&A, so we can get everybody's some input. For those of you who have questions, please use that Q&A button and go ahead and send them in, and we'll give Dr. Watkins a minute to weigh in on the points that Dr. Meyer and Dr. Lekus just made.
I actually don't have anything substantive that hasn't already been covered. So if we want to,
they will cover some ground. Yeah, they can be very comprehensive. Well, let me start then, Jay, with a question for you that's coming in. We have primarily a business school audience here, and this context is that you've all provided is so important, it's so informative. And so some of this is like, some of these questions that are coming in are like, okay, how do I take all of this and do the right thing on an everyday basis in my workplace? So here's a question. What is the single most important way friends and allies of LGBTQ workers can help continue the progress and encourage businesses to do the right thing? And Jay, that one's directed at you.
I think one of the most important ways, or one of the most useful ways, is to just speak up when we can. I've been in conversations with family lately, and the ways that we just continue to push back against people that are wrong, and to have the courage to look at friends and family and say, no, you are factually incorrect. Goodbye. And I think by doing that, and by standing ground with what is correct, my brother is going through this at the moment with a series of friends. One of his children is trans, and another, and I'm gay, and he looked a number of friends in the face and said, no, that is not okay. I choose my family over your sort of friendship. And I think that's one of the most important things we can do, is to speak up for our friends and our loved ones, and be unafraid to tell people, no, you're wrong and you should be quiet now.
I think that's good advice. Anytime we hear wrong behavior. So with the Lisa, this is a question for you. It's about microaggressions. Can you give us some examples of microaggressions that might unintentionally hurt trans and gender non-normative employees, things that we might not be aware of, things to avoid?
Sure. I mean, and part of the issue is microaggressions aren't always intentional, right? I mean, that's what makes them so hard. So but a fairly straightforward microaggression is if there is a trans employee who has transitioned recently, or it transitioned while they were in a workplace environment, right? So people knew them, have known them in different ways, you know, to like misgender is a microaggression. So if the person is sort of a trans woman, to call her he, or to not use the pronouns that that they have, you know, requested to be used. To another microaggression is what has been called dead naming. So using their former names. So if they were you know, they moved from something like Charlie to Janice. So you know, to say, hey, Chuck, you know, and when, you know, so using, you know, so dead naming, misgendering, those are the most common, I think, microaggressions. I mean, I also think microaggressions occur all the time, you know, back to the point that Dr. Watkins made in terms of how people talk about things, right? You know, if folks are, if in the workplace, you know, if I have coworkers who are you know, saying something sort of transphobic or homophobic, I mean, those are not so micro on the microaggressive level, but you know, if I don't, I consider the fact if I stay a bystander, then I am part of that aggression, right? I am complicit in it. I think we intervene on those levels as well, as much as we can. Again, in a workplace situation, you know, if it's a superior, you know, if it's a supervisor, and you know, I mean, how do we go about those things? But anyway, I've sort of got off the point. But I'll go back to my original point, which is that microaggressions are not always intentional, and they sometimes come out of ignorance. And so I think there's ignorance or just a mistake, you know. And I think that we have to be able to have a conversation about that in the workplace.
That's great. And I think one of the points that was made in one of our earlier presentations was that mistakes will happen. You know, people, as you said, it's not intentional. You know, most of the time it's not intentional. People just use the wrong pronoun, use the wrong name, do something like that. And I think the people who are then impacted by that have to recognize that people really are trying to do the right thing, but they don't always know what the right thing is. We've got just about a minute left, and I've got a really good question that I'd like a one-sentence answer from each of you. Okay, one-sentence answer. What would you like to see happen next for LGBTQ rights? Jay?
Universal health care.
Universal health care. Thank you.
That includes access to trans care, and includes HIV care, and includes everyone.
Healthcare for everyone, important. Ian, next step for LGBTQ rights.
Listen to what people need locally. If I was going to promote one global thing, decriminalization of homosexuality, followed by an end to conversion therapy.
Dr. Meyer, you have the last word.
Oh gosh, I would say return to where we were before marriage equality, and go back to some of the real focus on expanding, breaking out of marriage as a system and expanding the system of federal benefits and other kinds of social benefits to families of all different types. So not necessarily a two-partner with children sort of model, but like my roommate, who I might, families that are extended, etc. So moving away from a singular nuclear family model, that would be one.
Awesome. Well, I would like to continue the conversation for another hour or two or three, but y'all are too expensive. We're going to pay you for the hour, and that's what you get. Dr. Jay Watkins, thank you. Dr. Ian Lekus, thank you. Dr. Lisa Meyer, thank you so much for being here. I will turn it back over to Dr. Colleen Pittman to walk us out.
Thank you so much. Wow, I learned so much, and I'm sure our guests learned so much from your excellent presentation. It's clear that we have a long way to go. This is the start of a conversation. We have people on this call, and I hope that we continue discussing these important issues. I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Meyer, Dr. Watkins, and Dr. Lekus for your incredible remarks. James Boswell, thank you so much for your remarks as well, just being an excellent moderator. I'd like to thank our Mason Learning and Development Committee. Joyce Hogard is our chair of that, and she is leading this force in terms of getting this happening and starting these important conversations. And our entire Mason D&I committee, we are just really moving forward with starting some conversations that just really haven't happened. I'd like to leave you with a quote. So Tammy Baldwin was the first openly gay senator in 2013. And she says, there will not be a magic day when we wake up and it's now okay to express ourselves publicly. We make that day by doing things publicly until it's simply the way things are done. I wish you all well. I want you to continue to stay safe. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for joining us. It's so important to have these important conversations where we have like-minded people and people that are interested in these important topics. Thank you again. Take care. Bye-bye.